on to knight h5, the most critical and obvious move for white here. Here black has a very important resource, probably the most important move to remember in all these lines that we've looked at so far, and that's knight c6, just allowing white to come in with the knight to g7, which probably is the best that white can do here. Knight g7. Other moves can get him into trouble. For example, bishop b5 weakens this h3 square and allows white to come in, black to come in. White's forced the counter with the idea we looked at in the tactic videos, with queen f3 and king d1. However, here black has this move, f4, which is very strong. Queen f3 first can also be answered by f5, which looks, well, particularly horrible for white. So knight g7, king f8 is obviously forced. Now, white somehow has to stop knight d4 from coming in, which is going to be killing if it's black's move here. Knight d4 will just be winning. So d4 occurred in one game, which we're going to look at, which is going to play through the first few moves, just aiming to give away a pawn to stop this threat, which if that was all that white had to give away, it would be okay, because this knight is going to provide quite a lot of compensation. However, after c3, black can manoeuvre the queen out, and white's going to be forced to lose even more material now because of the queen coming into c2. And I don't think this white knight's going to provide enough compensation for all that material. Okay then, so on to knight f4. This is definitely the most critical move. Knight c6 is the move I recommend. We did cover the move g6 in the history videos from earlier on. There are reasons that I explained there, but I don't trust this move anymore. h5 is also weak, as queen f3, too many threats for white. So we'll focus on this move, knight c6. Now the main move, bishop b5, is really the one we'll look at in a lot of detail later. Now white has a number of options here. Knight d4 is the most obvious move, and as we mentioned in the tactical video, black's best response is to manoeuvre the queen to c4. This was first played, I believe, or first thought up by Recursive, and there are some similar ideas in other variations that you may have got the idea from, but it's particularly strong here, as after bishop takes queen, knight e5. Now moves like d4, d3 are going to transpose to the main line. I'll take king f1 as the main line. Moving the queen out to h5 is also possible. Perhaps queen f5. White will probably be able to get away with keeping his material loss to a minimum of maybe a piece for a pawn down, when black's going to be the only one who has real winning chances. Knight's coming into f3, d3, d4 will be quite similar, d3. Now knight d2 taking on b2 immediately is possible. It's probably worth playing this move, knight f6, gaining a tempo because of the knight g4 threat. h3. I suppose white could ignore it with knight c3, just aiming to take back on f3. Black's probably a touch better because of this misplaced king, or black could play knight d3 check, and then knight g4 with lots of good play. So it's probably best off stopping this, and then black can grab this well, we can either play for a draw with knight f3 or take this material, and I think black has more than enough material for the queen here. In fact, I think this line's so strong for black. He has other options as well. In fact, the old main line that I would recommend you avoid as black is knight d4, and this is countered by white by queen h5, bishop b5, knight c7. This is all forced really from black's point of view. Queen g5 check. The point of that was to prevent any knight f6 moves. d6, and now snap the queen off. And now the game sworded against GM Ubenze. Continued c takes b5, and white just has this strong knight for no compensation. Knight d7, and now knight e7 was just impossible to meet. And these pieces can't really escape. Nice little tactic there at the end. Also valid idea is the knight b4, which was mentioned recent to me by Recursive. I'm not sure it's good enough for an advantage, but I recommend analysing this position yourself. It's quite interesting. Seems to lead to about equality from my analysis anyway. But also possible is the idea swapping the queen off this way, and instead of knight e5 playing knight f6. Also might be worthy of independent analysis. The idea is obviously f3, the knight's coming into b4, and if queen f3, black can either carry on with knight e5 or maybe king d8. Bishop d6 is also perhaps interesting, gaining a lot of play against that queen. Certainly black's not in any trouble there. Lots of different options, all looking quite rosy. A very interesting move actually, a lot more interesting than knight d5, is queen h5. There's a key idea that black has to remember in these lines, which we'll come to in a moment. g6. Now knight d5 is probably a mistake, as queen h4. If this is taken, then knight f6, particularly strong. Coming into e4, threatening to win immediately. So g3. Queen d4. This can't be taken because of course g takes h5 and black will be a piece up. And now both of white's moves, aiming to gain some material for this knight before taking the queen, look winning for black. Knight f6, knight b4, hitting a2 and c2, and knight b6, taking on a2. Both cases black's winning. So more advisable move is queen h4, forcing the exchange of queens. If black simply blocks this queen, then knight d5 will be a powerful move. Bishop b4, aiming to come into d5, having neutralised a lot of black's counterplay by swapping the queens off. However, black has a very interesting idea, which is bishop b4, c3, king f8, unpinning this knight. Now, for example, castles. Black can play h5, stopping, getting some counterplay. Idea could bring this knight out maybe to h6, and knight d5 can be answered by knight d4. White can try some other moves. example, knight d5, probably quite a risky idea, as knight f6 is quite strong. And once this situation's been resolved, black often has this tactic sort of waiting in the wings, bishop a3. Now that the king has moved, this knight is no longer pinned against the pawn on d7. Therefore, it wants to often move to b4. And the idea of this bishop move is that white wants to move this bishop and play knight b4. And this moves the bishop with tempo, attacking b2. And therefore, after taking on b3, knight b4 comes in. A lot of these attacking a2, threatening knight c2. Black's doing very well. Blocking with knight c3 is also possible, again running into king f8. Threatening knight d4 now that the knight's on c3. And bishop takes c6 can be answered. Well, black has no problems after this bishop's taken here. It's doing perfectly okay. His king's slightly out of position here on f8. Whether it can maybe answer with d5. And this knight is also slightly out of place. Can answer with e5. He's got a good position. So this queen h5 idea is quite interesting, but as long as black remembers this key king f8 move, he should be fine. Knight h5, another well, actually this is a weak move. Black's getting a very good play. Knight d4 is actually quite strong here. Also bishop b4. I was going to say it's quite a natural move, knight h5, one that black should be aware of. c3, knight d4. Well, it's just killing coming into c2. Knight f6. This is the idea that if g takes f6, queen h5 will win for white. Bishop b5 maybe. The queen manoeuvre to h5 doesn't really help very much. Queen h4 can be answered by queen f6, threatening f2, gaining a tempo so this knight can now jump in. Bishop b5 will transpose. Yeah, again, queen h4, queen f6, winning for black. White can't avoid losing material. Knight c3 is also a mistake here, losing material for white. Queen h4, forcing g3, queen g4, forcing f3, and now knight b4, coming into c2. White's in big trouble. So we'll move on to the apart from bishop b